So today's content framing question is what's happening in the keeping quilt? And today's craft question is how does organizing an event sequence work? So here's your warm-up for today. It's actually an art piece. I want you to draw an illustration of something important or special about third grade at BCS, starting from September to now. I just want you to draw whatever's on your mind, something that stuck out to you, maybe a special field trip or a project or your friends or your teachers or the BCS bookstore, maybe a prize you received in third grade, a party, anything that's important or special to you about third grade. And I want you to draw it in a square. Okay, so it's important that if you're using a scrap paper at home, I want you to draw a black square and then draw your illustration and color inside. Or if you have a printer at home, I attached a document or a picture that you can download and print, and there's a black square that I want you to draw your illustration inside of. I also want you to make sure that you use lots of colors, and I'm going to show you two examples that I did on the iPad. Okay, that's your first part of today's assignment, and I am going to put them all together to create our own third grade virtual quilt. Alright, so here is what I drew on the iPad to make it colorful. I made a 324 with different color tiles inside and wrote a little note saying miss you, and then also High Five Friday because it was one of our routines that we did every Friday in 324. Alright, so now thinking about our warm-up activity that you just completed, how will our quilt be similar to the quilt in the story, The Keeping Quilt? I want you to take the next couple seconds to think about the answer to this question. Well, I hope you answer something similarly, that our quilt will tell the story of our class in the same way that Anna's quilt tells the story of her family. Alright, also I want to emphasize that the genre of the Keeping Quilt is realistic fiction, just like Alan Say's text. So this is a little tricky because the narrator of our story is Patricia and the author's name is Patricia Polacco. However, this is not actually a book full of facts or true events, but it is the narrator or storyteller referring to herself as her name, Patricia, but she uses her family memories to create a piece of fiction. So she's taking her own personal memories and creating stories about them. So for these next three questions for your classwork, you can either listen to the story again, or you can look through the text by looking at the PDF. It is in your classwork under the topic text, and you should be able to see The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco there. Alright, so the first question you need to answer is where and when is the Keeping Quilt set? Okay. Where did Anna's family travel? So you can say from blank to blank, and the last is who is the narrator of The Keeping Quilt and how do you know? So who is the speaker in this book? Alright, and so the answers will be revealed throughout this video, but I do want you to try on your own. If not, I will know you're paying attention to the video if your answers are correct here. Okay? So in thinking about where did Anna's family travel, they traveled from Russia to New York City, which is more than 6,000 miles away. I want you to notice how far Russia is from New York City. Look at all the other countries in between and the bodies of water. Alright, so this next piece is the character chart, and this is going to help us keep track of the events that take place in this book, because throughout this book a long period of time has passed, and so this part of your classwork should also help you answer these three questions up here. And so again, I have that stated up here so you can reread it to understand the purpose of this character chart. And so on the first column, you see all the characters' names throughout the text. So you see Anna's mother, Anna, Sasha, Carl, George, Mary Ellen, Patricia, Enzo, Mario, and Tracy Denise. And then here's where you need to fill out the relationship, that character's relationship to the narrator, who is Patricia. Okay, so you need to tell me if they are the great-great-grandmother or grandmother or grandfather, auntie, uncle, mother, father. Do your best to write down the relationship here. Then I want you to write here how the person uses the keeping quilt. So this one you need to re-listen to the story. I'm going to insert a clip of the keeping quilt read aloud again here, and I want you to listen carefully and jot down separately on maybe some scrap paper so that you can pause the video when you're reading it. When I'm reading it to you, and you can write down, oh, that person or that character is mentioned in the text, I'm going to write down how they're using the keeping quilt right now. Okay? And then also keep track of who's who throughout the text from the beginning, right? This is in time order, which we're going to talk about in a bit as well, but it starts from the first generation all the way to Tracy Denise. Okay? So yeah, please pay attention, take notes so that you can fill out this character chart. And in tomorrow's lesson, I will show you the answer key. And so you can double check your work. And then you're going to have to also add additional information tomorrow. But that's for tomorrow's lesson. So I need you to make sure that you complete this lesson or this chart today. All right, so before I get to your read aloud or your second read aloud for today, I did create this vocabulary words chart for you with some images to help you understand what these words mean. I took, again, the unknown words that you wrote in yesterday's classwork, and I created this chart for you. And so let's go through it. So some of you wrote that you weren't sure what a babushka was, and it's a triangle-shaped scarf worn on the head. It's also shown in the illustrations in the keeping quilt, but here I have the queen wearing a babushka. Sabbath is the day of rest and worship from Friday night until Saturday night for Jews and for some Christians. So this word is actually also in your question set from yesterday. So if you read your question set or completed your question set yesterday, you should know what this word means now. Now, challah. So it's bread of celebration in Jewish tradition. And so this is what challah bread looks like. You can sometimes see this in the grocery stores, especially in Brooklyn. A quilt. So a quilt is a blanket made of pieces of fabric and featuring decorative stitching. So it was kind of silly that some of you wrote this word down, but I realized that it may be difficult to kind of imagine or picture it in our heads, even though it's in our text. And so here's what a quilt would look like. As you can see here, it's made of these different pieces of fabric all stitched together. And it's a collection, right? And so thinking about what this keeping quilt meant for their family, for Anna and Patricia's extended family, or generations and generations of her family, what that meant to kind of put everything together. Okay. Fabric is cloth. Okay, so here's just a picture of different pieces of cloth or different colors. Stitching is a series of pieces of thread that is passed through a piece of material with a needle. So here you see different types of stitches. Some are in an X shape, some just go back and forth. And some are thicker, some are shorter, longer. So that's what stitching is. It just keeps the material usually together or for decoration purposes. You can find this in your backpacks, on your clothes. Now, kulik is a tall, round sweetbread drizzled with a sugar glaze for a sweet treat, typically baked for Easter in Russia. So it's a Russian traditional cake. It's also the cake that's described in our text as having fruit and a sweet like glaze on top. And then huppah is a canopy under which the bride and bridegroom stand, especially in a Jewish wedding ceremony. So you see here where my mouse is, this is the huppah. Okay. So these are some of the words that you are going to hear again in this next read aloud. All right, so here's The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. When my great-grandma Anna came to America, she wore the same thick overcoat and big boots she had worn for farm work. But her family weren't dirt farmers anymore. In New York City, her father's work was hauling things on a wagon, and the rest of the family made artificial flowers all day. Everyone was in a hurry, and it was so crowded, not like in back home Russia, but all the same it was their home, and most of their neighbors were just like them. When Anna went to school, English sounded to her like pebbles dropping into shallow water. Shh, shh, shh. In 6 months, she was speaking English. Her parents almost never learned, so she spoke English for them too. The only things she had left of back home Russia were her dress and the babushka she liked to throw up into the air when she was dancing. And her dress was getting too small. After her mother had sewn her a new one, she took her old dress and babushka. Then, from a basket of old clothes, she took Uncle Vladimir's shirt, Aunt Havala's nightdress, and an apron of Aunt Natasha's. "We will make a quilt to help us always remember home," Anna's mother said. "It will be like having the family in back home Russia dance around us at night." And so it was. Anna's mother invited all the neighborhood ladies. They cut out animals and flowers from the scraps of clothing. Anna kept the needles threaded and handed them to the ladies as they needed them. The border of the quilt was made of Anna's babushka. On Friday nights, Anna's mother would say the prayers that started the Sabbath. The family ate challah and chicken soup. The quilt was the tablecloth. Anna grew up and fell in love with great-grandpa Sasha. To show he wanted to be her husband, he gave Anna a gold coin, a dried flower, and a piece of rock salt, all tied into a linen handkerchief. The gold was for wealth, the flower for love, and salt so their lives would have flavor. She accepted the hanky. They were engaged. Under the wedding huppah, Anna and Sasha promised each other love and understanding. After the wedding, the men and women celebrated separately. When my grandma Carl was born, Anna wrapped her daughter in the quilt to welcome her warmly into the world. Carl was given a gift of gold, flowers, salt, and bread. Gold, so she would never know poverty. A flower, so she would always know love. Salt, so her life would always have flavor. And bread, so that she would never know hunger. Carl learned to keep the Sabbath and to cook and clean and do washing. "Married you'll be someday," Anna told Carl. And again, the quilt became a wedding huppah, this time for Carl's wedding to Grandpa George. Men and women celebrated together, but they still did not dance together. In Carl's wedding bouquet was a gold coin, bread, and salt. Carl and George moved to a farm in Michigan, and great-grandma Anna came to live with them. The quilt once again wrapped a new little girl, Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen called Anna Lady Grandma. She had grown very old and was sick a lot of the time. The quilt kept her legs warm. On Anna's 98th birthday, the cake was kulik, a rich cake with raisins and candied fruit in it. When great-grandma Anna died, prayers were said to lift her soul to heaven. My mother, Mary Ellen, was now grown up. When Mary Ellen left home, she took the quilt with her. When she became a bride, the quilt became her huppah. For the first time, friends who were not Jews came to the wedding. My mother wore a suit, but in her bouquet were gold, bread, and salt. The quilt welcomed me, Patricia, into the world, and it was the tablecloth for my first birthday. At night, I would trace my fingers around the edges of each animal on the quilt before I went to sleep. I told my mother stories about the animals on the quilt. She told me whose sleeve had made the horse, whose apron had made the chicken, whose dress had made the flowers, and whose babushka went around the edge of the quilt. The quilt was a pretend cape when I was in the bullring, or sometimes a tent in the steaming Amazon jungle. At my wedding to Enzo Mario, men and women danced together. In my bouquet were gold, bread, and salt, and a sprinkle of wine, so I would always know laughter. "20 years ago, I held Tracy Denise in the quilt for the first time. Someday she, too, will leave home, and she will take the quilt with her." The end. All right, so now for vocabulary, the word generation I wanted to tell you is that it means people, usually in a family, born at about the same time. Note that usually is underlined because it's not always just related to family. For example, my generation loved to play MASH and rented VHS tapes. I believe your generation loves Roblox and TikTok. So if you're curious what MASH or VHS tapes are, you can totally ask a mom, dad, auntie, or uncle. So these two examples of generation include people that are born at about the same time, not necessarily family. The next example is going to be related to family. The Keeping Quilt tells the story of blank generations of a single family. So I want you to think about every time the character gets married and has a child, which is Anna's mother, then Anna, Carl, Mary Ellen, then Patricia, and then Denise, which tells us that there were 6 generations of a single family in the Keeping Quilt. All right, so how do you know that the quilt is important to Aunt Anna's family? I want you to write down the answer right here. How do you know it's important? Right, what is it used for? Which leads us to the last part of your classwork today is using the time order linking words. So I already wrote them here for you. First, next, later, after that, when, and finally. I'm going to show you a chart in just a moment. Or actually, I'll show you that chart now, and then we'll continue. All right, so here is your time order words and phrases anchor chart, which is a list of linking words such as first, next, later, and finally, which can show you the order of events in the story to show how each generation used the quilt, specifically for the Keeping Quilt. So these words are, if you follow along with me, at first, at last, at that moment, after, as soon as, before, between, by, during, earlier, eventually, first, finally, following, from then on, in the beginning, in the meantime, in the end, later, not long ago, now, next, second, soon, starting with, suddenly, then, tomorrow, when, and yesterday. All right, so thinking about what those words are, you are going to list or write down 6 sentences. I wrote the last 2 for you, so you only need to write 4. And I want you to identify how the quilt was used in each generation. So starting from the beginning, Anna's mother, how did she use the quilt? Then Anna, how did she use the quilt? Carl, then Mary Ellen. The last 2 I gave you, when Patricia grew up, she got married under the Keeping Quilt. They used it as a canopy or kulik. And finally, Patricia wrapped her daughter in the Keeping Quilt. And her daughter's name is Denise. In the Keeping Quilt.